Harlan Greer didn't even have the decency to meet her at the stage. He sent a boy, 12 years old, maybe 13, holding a folded note like it was something ordinary, like he was delivering a grocery list instead of destroying a woman's life. Clara took the paper with both hands because she didn't know yet what it was. She thought maybe it was directions to the ranch. Maybe a warm welcome from a man who'd been waiting on her the same way she'd been waiting on him through 4 states and 11 days of hard road. She read it once. Then she read it again. Miss Ren, after receiving your photograph, I have determined we are not suited. I have made other arrangements. You should return to wherever you came from. H. Greer. That was it. No apology, no money for the return fare, no acknowledgement that she'd sold her mother's brooch to buy the ticket west. The boy held out his hand for a tip. If you've ever felt the ground disappear from under your feet, not in a dream, but in real, waking life, then you know exactly what Clara felt standing in the middle of that Hallow Creek street with 37 people watching her read the worst moment of her life. Don't go anywhere. Subscribe to this channel and hit that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled, because what happens next to Clara is something I promise you will not forget. The stagecoach that brought Clara to Hallow Creek had been loud, crowded, and miserable for the better part of 3 days. She'd shared the bench with a salesman who smelled like camphor and a young mother who cried quietly into her baby's blanket the whole way through Oklahoma. Clara had kept her eyes forward and her hands folded in her lap, the way her mother had taught her to sit when she was uncertain. Spine straight, chin level, everything held together on the outside so nothing spilled. She'd been holding herself like that for a long time now. The town came into view through the dust, a flat, sun-bleached collection of buildings pressed against the Texas horizon like they were trying not to blow away. She'd seen worse places. She'd seen better ones too. It didn't matter. What mattered was that somewhere in this town, a man named Harlan Greer was waiting to become her husband, and Clara was going to make that work if it killed her. She was 31 years old. She had $42, a trunk with a broken latch, and the kind of stubbornness that doesn't announce itself. The stage lurched to a stop. The salesman elbowed past her to get out first. Clara stepped down onto the street and looked around. No one was holding flowers. No one was holding a sign. She hadn't expected flowers exactly, but she'd thought maybe he'd be there. The letter they'd exchanged had been brief but not unkind. He'd described himself as a practical man with a working ranch who needed a practical woman. She'd described herself honestly, capable, experienced with household management, not afraid of hard work. They hadn't talked about love. Neither of them had pretended this was about love. It was an arrangement, a practical one. That was fine. Clara was a practical woman. She waited while the driver unloaded luggage from the roof. People moved around her on the boardwalk. Women in calico dresses, men with dust on their hats, a couple of children chasing a dog past the general store. Nobody paid her attention for the first 2 minutes. Then the boy appeared. He couldn't have been more than 12. He had a gap between his front teeth and a note folded in quarters that he held out toward her with the confidence of someone who did this all the time. "You the lady from Missouri?" he said. "I am," Clara said. "Mr. Greer said to give you this." She took it, unfolded it, read it. The boy stood there. She read it again because the first time didn't make complete sense. Her brain kept skipping over the words, looking for a different meaning, the way you look for a door in a wall that doesn't have one. "After receiving your photograph, I have determined we are not suited." Her photograph. She'd sent it 3 weeks ago at his request. She'd stood in front of a white sheet in a photographer's studio in Kansas City wearing her best dress, the blue one with the ivory buttons, and she'd tried to look pleasant without looking desperate, which was harder than it sounds when you were a woman alone with $42 and no one left to go home to. He'd seen her face and decided no. That was the whole of it. He hadn't met her, hadn't spoken with her, hadn't given her the basic courtesy of looking her in the eye before deciding she wasn't worth the trouble. He'd looked at a piece of paper, a photograph, and made his judgment, and then sent a child to deliver the verdict while he did whatever practical, important things men like Harlan Greer did with their mornings. "Ma'am," the boy said, "you need me to take your trunk somewhere?" Clara folded the note. She put it in her coat pocket. She looked at the boy, who had a smear of something, jam, maybe, on his left cheek, and she felt something shift inside her chest, not quite breaking, not quite holding either. Something in between. "No," she said. "I can manage." She didn't cry. She told herself she wasn't going to cry in the street in a town where she didn't know a single person, and she held to that the way she'd held to the stage bench through the bad roads in Oklahoma, white-knuckled and without complaint. She picked up her small travel bag, the trunk the driver had already left on the boardwalk. She put on her bonnet, she pulled it low. That was when she noticed the people watching. It wasn't overt. Hallow Creek was a town where the gossip moved faster than the weather, but the people doing it had enough manners to pretend they weren't. A woman near the dry goods store had stopped walking. Two men outside the barber shop were talking to each other, but their eyes kept drifting over. The stage driver, who'd already seen too much of the world to be unkind, gave her a look that was almost pity, and then looked away. They'd seen the boy. They'd seen the note. And in a town this size, they already knew what it meant. Clara squared her shoulders and walked toward the hotel. The woman behind the front desk at the Hallow Creek Hotel was named Mrs. Pettiford, and she was the kind of person who treated information like currency and never passed up a chance to spend it. She looked Clara up and down with the kind of thoroughness that took in the worn hem of the traveling dress, the cheap bonnet, the trunk with the broken latch, and arrived at a conclusion before Clara had finished saying her own name. "Just you?" Mrs. Pettiford said. "Just me." "How long are you planning on staying?" "I haven't decided yet." That wasn't a lie. Clara genuinely had not decided, because her options at the moment were so thin she couldn't call them options. She could take the stage back east, if she had the fare, which she barely did. She could stay in this town and find work, if there was work to find. She could sit down on the floor of this hotel and have the cry she'd been holding in since she read Harlan Greer's note, but that wasn't going to solve anything. "Room's $2 a night," Mrs. Pettiford said. "Breakfast is included. You'll need to let me know by supper if you're staying on." "I'll let you know by supper," Clara said. The room was small and clean. There was a window that looked out over the alley beside the hotel, which was not a view, but it had light. Clara set her trunk down at the foot of the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress and let herself be still for a moment. Just a moment. She took the note out of her pocket and read it one more time. "You should return to wherever you came from." She put it on the nightstand. She looked at it. Then she picked it up, walked to the small iron stove in the corner, opened the grate, and dropped it in. She didn't watch it burn. She went to the window instead. By noon, she knew the shape of what she was dealing with. The town wasn't large, maybe 400 people, possibly fewer. There was a main street with the usual arrangement: hotel, general store, saloon, feed merchant, a small newspaper office, a doctor's office with a hand-painted sign, 2 churches, a school that looked like it needed a new roof. Beyond the buildings, the land opened up into the kind of flat, endless Texas distance that could either break you or cure you, depending on the day. She walked the main street twice, slowly, carrying herself the way her mother had taught her. The bonnet helped. It narrowed her field of vision and other people's view of her face, which right now felt like an advantage. She could feel the stares without quite meeting them. She heard as she passed the barber shop a man's voice say, "That's her, the one Greer turned down," and she kept walking. She stopped at the general store and spent 43 cents on a small notebook and a pencil. The man behind the counter, heavy-set, with a graying mustache, took her money without much conversation, but his wife, who was restocking a shelf nearby, said, "You're the one from Missouri, aren't you?" in the tone of someone who already knows the answer. "I am," Clara said. "Hard thing," the woman said, but her voice had curiosity mixed into the sympathy. The way people get when someone else's trouble is interesting enough to be almost entertainment. "I've had harder," Clara said, and walked out. She had 2 weeks of hotel money if she was careful, maybe 3 if she skipped a meal here and there, which she was already used to. She needed work. That was the immediate, practical problem, and Clara had always been better at practical problems than emotional ones, so she turned her mind toward it and let the other thing, the photograph, the note, the boy with jam on his face, sit in a corner where she didn't have to look at it directly. She asked at the laundry. The woman there said she had enough help. She asked at the hotel kitchen. Mrs. Pettiford said she'd think about it, which Clara understood to mean no. She asked at the newspaper office, where a young man with ink-stained fingers looked at her with surprise and said they didn't hire women, then immediately looked embarrassed about saying it. She walked back to the hotel at 3 in the afternoon with sore feet and no prospects and the beginning of a headache building behind her left eye. She sat in the small chair by the window in her room and opened the notebook to the first page and started writing down numbers. What she had, what she needed, how long she could make one last before it became the other. She was good at numbers, always had been. Her father had taught her, a kind, careful man who believed that a woman who understood her own finances was a woman who could take care of herself. She could run a household account down to the penny. She could spot an error in a ledger at 30 yards. Back in Missouri, before everything had come apart, she'd managed the accounts for her father's horse breeding operation. Invoices, payroll, feed costs, sale records, all of it. It had been real work, work that mattered. Nobody here knew that. They just knew she was the woman Harlan Greer had rejected from a photograph. She was still sitting there with her notebook when the wind picked up. She heard it before she felt it, that particular low moan the Texas wind makes when it means business. She'd had enough experience with prairie weather to know what it was. She went to the window and saw the dust moving down the street, the kind of low brown roll that lifted anything not nailed down and carried it to the next county. She'd hung her wash on the line behind the hotel that morning, her other dress, her underthings, the white cotton blouse that had been her mother's. She was out the back door before she'd fully decided to go. The line was already in trouble. Her dress was pulling at the wooden pins, the fabric snapping hard in the wind. One pin had already lost the fight. She could see something white tumbling toward the fence at the far end of the yard. She ran for it. The wind hit her full in the face, and she grabbed for the blouse and caught it by the hem just before it cleared the fence. "Other end!" She looked up. A man was at the far end of her clothesline, pressing her dress flat against the fabric before the wind could take it. He wasn't a big man exactly. Broad in the shoulder, lean through the middle, the kind of build that came from actual work rather than anything deliberate. He had a face that had spent a lot of time outdoors, weathered without being rough, and he was looking at her dress with the focused attention of someone solving a small, immediate problem. He unpinned it from the line efficiently, folded it once against the wind, and held it out toward her. "You got the rest?" he said. Yes." She tucked the blouse under her arm, moved to the sheet she'd also washed that morning. Together, without discussing it, they took down the remaining items before the worst of the wind arrived. It took less than 2 minutes. When it was done, Clara had an armful of laundry and a mild awareness that this was the first time since she'd stepped off the stagecoach that someone had helped her without making her feel like a charity case. "Thank you," she said. "Wind comes up fast here," he said. It wasn't an explanation exactly, more like something he'd said so she'd feel less embarrassed about not knowing. "I'm learning that," she said. He nodded once. He wasn't looking at her with the particular expression she'd gotten used to in the past 6 hours, that mix of pity and curiosity and mild judgment. He was just looking at her the way a person looks at another person. She found she didn't know quite what to do with that. "You're staying at the hotel?" he said. "For now." Another nod. He looked like he was going to say something else, then thought better of it. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture so brief it was almost nothing, and turned to go. "I'm Clara," she said. She didn't know why. Maybe because he was the first person who'd talked to her today without needing something from her, and that felt like it deserved a name. He stopped, turned halfway back. "Eli Cole," he said. He walked around the side of the hotel, and she didn't see which direction he went from there. She stood in the wind with her arms full of clean laundry and the beginning of something she couldn't name yet. Not hope, exactly, because hope felt like too much after a day like this one. Something smaller. Something that was just the fact of having been helped without being pitied. She went upstairs. She folded the laundry carefully. She ate the biscuit she'd saved from breakfast. She sat with her notebook and her numbers until the sun went down. The next morning was worse. She woke to the sound of voices carrying through the thin hotel walls. Mrs. Pettiford in the hallway below, talking to someone. and the words came up through the floorboards with the particular clarity that gossip always seems to have. Came all the way from Missouri, can you imagine? And Harlan didn't even bother to show his face. What's wrong with her, do you think? Well, you've seen her, that bonnet she wears. She can't stay in that hotel forever on her own. I give her a week. Clara lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling. The plaster had a crack running from the window to the center of the room. She followed it with her eyes, back and forth, until her breathing steadied. Then she got up, washed her face, put on the dress that was slightly less worn, and went downstairs. Mrs. Pettiford stopped talking the instant Clara appeared. The woman she'd been talking to, someone Clara hadn't met yet, found something urgent to study near the staircase railing. "Good morning," Clara said pleasantly to both of them. "Morning," Mrs. Pettiford said, with the guilty brightness of someone who's just been caught. Clara went into the dining room and had her breakfast and made herself eat every bit of it, because she'd learned a long time ago that you couldn't think straight on an empty stomach, and she had a great deal of thinking to do. She was on her second cup of coffee when a man walked into the dining room who hadn't been there before. He was probably 50, with a neat suit that looked expensive for Hallow Creek, and he sat down 2 tables away and nodded at the serving girl with the ease of someone who ate here regularly. Clara had her notebook open. She was reviewing her numbers again, looking for angles she might have missed. "You're the woman who arrived on yesterday's stage," the man said across the 2 tables. She looked up. "I am." "Harlan Greer is an idiot," the man said pleasantly, like he was commenting on the weather. "For what it's worth." She looked at him for a moment. "It's worth something," she said. "Gerald Fitch." He didn't get up, just offered the name like a handshake across the distance. "I run the land office. Clara Ren." "You looking for work, Miss Ren?" She set down her coffee cup. "Why do you ask?" "Small town," he said. "Mrs. Pettiford talks." "Evidently." He seemed to find that amusing. "I'm not offering anything. I don't have a position to offer. I'm just thinking out loud. A woman who can manage her own money well enough to make it to Texas on her own is usually a woman with useful skills." "I can manage accounts," she said. It came out more directly than she'd intended, but she was tired of performing modesty she didn't feel. "Ledgers, invoices, payroll. I managed a horse breeding operation in Missouri for 4 years. Fitch raised his eyebrows, not skeptically, more like he was genuinely revising his estimate of something. "That's more than I expected." "Most people expect less," she said. He nodded slowly. "You should talk to Eli Cole," he said. Something shifted slightly in her chest at the name. She kept her expression neutral. "The man who helped me with my wash yesterday?" "That's the one." Fitch poured himself more coffee from the pot the girl had left on the table. "Eli runs the biggest spread in this county. Doesn't look it, which is his business, but it's true. He's been doing his own books for 3 years since his foreman quit, and frankly," he paused, like he was deciding how much to say, "he's better at cattle than numbers." "I see," Clara said. "Just a thought," Fitch said, and turned to his breakfast. Clara sat with her coffee and thought about it. The man in the yard. The brief efficiency of how he'd moved, unpinning her dress without drama. The way he'd given her his name like it was a thing he didn't hand out carelessly. She picked up her pencil and wrote 2 words at the bottom of the page. Eli Cole. Then she turned the page and started a new column of numbers, because thinking about something was not the same as doing something, and Clara had never been much for sitting still. Teaked. She went to the land office that afternoon, not to talk to Fitch again. He'd said he had nothing to offer, and she believed him. But the land office had public records, and Clara had learned a long time ago that public records told you things about a place that people wouldn't tell you directly. She wanted to understand Hallow Creek before she made any decisions about what to do next. She wanted to know who owned what the land situation was, which ranches were active, which were struggling. She wanted to understand the shape of the thing before she tried to find her place in it. The clerk at the land office was a young man named Bert, who was clearly bored and clearly happy to have someone to talk to, which meant he talked more than he probably should have. He told her about the county's major landholders, about the water rights situation, about the dispute over the northern grazing territory, about which ranchers were doing well and which weren't. He clearly liked having an audience, and Clara was very good at being an audience when she needed information. Cole Ranch, she said at one point, keeping her voice casual. Bert's face changed slightly. That's Eli's place. Northwest of town, maybe 8 miles. 3,000 acres, give or take. Some people think it's less, but I've seen the survey maps. He lowered his voice like they were discussing something private. He keeps to himself. People around here, they sort of forgot how big it is because he doesn't act like a man with that much land. What does a man with that much land usually act like? Clara asked. Bert thought about it. Louder, he said, finally. Clara thanked him for his time and walked out into the afternoon sun. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment, turning things over in her mind. 3,000 acres. She'd been calculating the finances of a horse operation a quarter that size. She knew what kind of paperwork 3,000 acres generated. She knew what happened to ranches that let their records slip, invoices lost, payment disputes, grazing agreements forgotten, tax filings missed. She pulled her bonnet lower against the sun. Somewhere behind her she heard a woman say, "There she is," in a voice that carried exactly as far as it needed to. Clara didn't turn around. She walked back toward the hotel, and she thought about Eli Cole, and she thought about her $42, and she thought about what her father had told her the last time she'd seen him, standing in the doorway of the house in Missouri in the early morning light. A person who knows their own value doesn't need the world to agree with them. They just need one good chance. She'd been waiting on that chance for what felt like a very long time. She stopped walking. She turned around. She walked to the stable at the edge of town and asked the man there if she could hire a horse for the afternoon. He looked at her bonnet and her dress, and he looked like he was about to say something about it. "I can ride," she said before he could. "I grew up on a horse farm. How much?" He quoted her a price. She paid it without negotiating because some things were worth more than the money. She rode northwest out of town into the flat open reach of Texas land that spread in every direction without apology, and she thought about what she was going to say to a man she'd met for 2 minutes over a clothesline, and how to say it without sounding desperate, and whether she had any other real options besides the truth. She decided she didn't. The truth, then. She kept riding. The late afternoon sun was long and amber across the grass when she crested the low rise and saw the Cole Ranch spread out below her, fence lines running straight and far, a cluster of buildings arranged with the practical geometry of people who'd built things to last rather than to impress. A good water tank, a large barn that needed new paint on the south face but was structurally sound, horses in the near pasture, quality animals. She could see that even from here. The house itself was modest, larger than it looked from the road, she suspected, but nothing like what 3,000 acres could have justified if the man who owned it was different than he seemed to be. She rode down. A ranch hand near the gate looked up when she arrived, and she told him she was looking for Eli Cole, and he went to find him without a lot of fuss. She waited on horseback, which she preferred because it was more comfortable than standing around feeling uncertain. Eli came out of the barn. He looked at her. There was a moment where he was clearly placing her. The hotel, the clothesline, the wind. Then he recognized her, and his expression settled into something neutral and not unfriendly. "Miss Ren," he said. "Mr. Cole." She kept her voice even. "I heard you've been running your own account since your foreman left. I'd like to offer you my services as a bookkeeper. I managed accounts for a horse operation in Missouri for 4 years. Invoices, payroll, purchase records, tax filings. I'm organized, I'm accurate, and I'm available." He looked at her for a moment. A hand was watching them from across the yard. Someone in the barn had gone quiet in the specific way people go quiet when they're listening. "Who told you my foreman left?" Eli said. "Gerald Fitch mentioned it. Fitch talks too much." "He does," Clara agreed, "but he's not wrong about the accounts." Something moved across Eli's face that might have been amusement if it had gone any further. He looked at her horse. He looked at her hands, which she'd kept quiet in her lap. "You know cattle records?" "I know record keeping," she said. "Cattle aren't that different from horses. Numbers are numbers." He was quiet for a long moment. The wind came through the grass at the edge of the yard and moved on. "What are you asking for wages?" he said. She told him. "A fair number. Not low enough to seem desperate, not high enough to seem foolish." She'd calculated it last night in the notebook. He didn't blink. "When could you start?" he said. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "If that works?" He nodded once. "Be here by 7, he said. "I'll have the books ready for you." He went back into the barn. She sat on the borrowed horse for a moment longer because her hands had started shaking. Just slightly, just the way they did when something tightly held suddenly had somewhere to go. And she needed a second before she rode back. She'd asked for a chance. He'd given her one. She turned the horse around and headed back toward Hallow Creek, and the sun was going down behind her and the grass was moving in the last of the afternoon light. And she didn't let herself think yet about whether this was going to work, whether he'd keep his word, whether something else would come apart before she could fix anything. She just rode. One chance, that was enough to start with. She was at the ranch gate at 6:53. Not because she was trying to impress anyone, because she hadn't slept well, and lying in the hotel bed staring at the ceiling crack felt worse than getting up and doing something about the morning. She'd braided her hair tighter than usual, put on the slightly better dress, and told herself on the ride out that whatever state Eli Cole's books were in, she'd seen worse. She had to believe that because she needed this to work. The ranch hand who'd fetched Eli the day before was already at the water pump when she arrived. He was younger than she'd registered, maybe 20, with the sunburned neck and the particular wariness of someone who'd learned not to assume things about strangers. "Ma'am," he said. "Morning," she said. "I'm here to see Mr. Cole. I'm starting work today." The young man's expression did something complicated. Not quite surprised, not quite the other thing. "Yeah," he said. "He mentioned." He nodded toward the house. "Kitchen door's open. He said to go on in." She tied the horse, she'd rented the same one because familiarity was worth the extra few cents, and walked to the kitchen door and knocked anyway, because walking into a man's house uninvited was not something she intended to make a habit of, regardless of what she'd been told. "It's open," Eli called from somewhere inside. The kitchen was exactly what she'd expected from the outside of the house. Practical, worn, not dirty, but not particularly cared for either. A cast-iron stove that worked hard and was never thanked for it. A table with 4 chairs, one of which had a crack in the back rail held together with a leather strap. A shelf of mismatched cups. The smell of coffee that had been sitting too long. Eli was at the table with a box. Not a filing system, not a ledger cabinet, a box. A wooden crate, the kind you'd use to ship apples, sitting on the kitchen table and apparently containing everything that passed for the financial records of a 3,000-acre cattle ranch. Clara looked at the box. She looked at Eli. "I know," he said. "How long has it been like this?" He thought about it. 3 years? She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She reached into the crate and drew out a handful of papers. Receipts, some of them, invoices from suppliers, a few loose pages of handwritten notes that might have been payroll records if she squinted at the right angle. "Your foreman kept these?" she said. "Pete kept his own system," Eli said. "I didn't ask questions because the numbers always came out right at the end of the month." "Did they?" A pause. "I assumed they did." Clara set the papers down. She looked at Eli, who was looking at the crate with the expression of a man who had been successfully not thinking about something for 3 years and was now being forced to look at it directly. "I'm going to need a proper workspace," she said. "Flat surface, good light. Do you have a desk anywhere?" "Office," he said. "Through there." He nodded toward a door off the main room. "I'm going to need all of this sorted before I can tell you anything useful. That'll probably take today and part of tomorrow. After that, I can tell you where you actually stand." "How bad is it, do you think?" "I think," she said carefully, "that you've been lucky, and that luck is not a bookkeeping system." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Not offended, more like someone who'd just heard a thing they'd suspected for a long time said out loud for the first time. "Fair enough," he said. He stood up and lifted the crate. "I'll show you the office." The office was better than the kitchen. A real desk, a window facing east so it would have morning light, a shelf with a few actual ledger books that had been opened and then clearly abandoned partway through. Someone had started trying to organize things, maybe 2 years back, and then stopped. Clara recognized the pattern. It was what happened when a capable person ran out of time, or patience, or both. Eli set the crate on the desk and went to leave. "Mr. Cole," she said. He stopped in the doorway. "Do you have a list of your current suppliers? Anyone you have ongoing accounts with?" He thought about it. Heller's feed store in town, Calhoun over in Mira Springs for breeding stock occasionally. The vet, when we need him, that's Doc Reeves. He comes out from Dalton. Wages for 6 hands, plus Pete used to take a cut as foreman. He paused. There's also a water rights agreement with the county. Been in place since my father's time. That should be in the box somewhere. Should be, she said. Yeah, he said. Should be. He left her to it. She worked through the morning without stopping. The box was worse than she'd let on. Not catastrophically wrong, but the kind of slow accumulation of ignored details that became expensive over time. Receipts for supplies that hadn't been logged against any payment record. Wages paid in inconsistent amounts to the same hands, suggesting either raises that had never been formalized or mistakes that had been papered over. A breeding stock purchase from 18 months ago that appeared to have been paid twice, or possibly not at all. She couldn't tell yet, which was itself the problem. The water rights agreement was at the bottom of the crate, folded 4 times, with a coffee ring on the outside and a signature she couldn't read in the bottom corner. She unfolded it carefully and read it twice. The terms were reasonable, the kind of agreement that made sense when it was written, 20 years ago at least, but there was a renewal clause buried in the 3rd paragraph that she'd want to look at again once she understood the rest of the picture. At noon, one of the hands knocked on the office door and told her Eli had said there was food in the kitchen if she wanted it. She ate standing at the kitchen counter, beans and cornbread and coffee that was, if anything, stronger than the mornings, and went back to work. By mid-afternoon, she had 3 piles on the desk. Things she understood, things she didn't understand yet, and things that concerned her. The 3rd pile was not the largest, but it was not small either. She was still working when she heard the commotion in the yard. 2 voices, both male, neither of them Eli. She heard them through the office window. Not the words exactly, but the tone, which was the particular tone of men who are working themselves up to something. Then she heard Eli's voice, lower, steadier. She stayed at the desk for another 30 seconds. Then she got up. From the office window she could see the yard. 2 men on horseback, both dressed better than ranch hands, town clothes, good boots. One of them was doing most of the talking. He was maybe 45 with the kind of square jaw that in a younger man might have been handsome, and in a man his age had settled into something that just looked permanent and unbothered by disagreement. She didn't recognize him, but she could read the body language from 50 feet away. He was a man who was used to having conversations that ended the way he wanted them to. Eli was standing in the yard with his arms at his sides, not aggressive, not backing up either. She went to the kitchen door and stood in the doorway where she could hear. Just reminding you that the northern pasture boundary has always been understood as the creek line, the man on horseback was saying. The survey map says different, Eli said. Survey maps get things wrong. Not this one. The man shifted in his saddle. He looked for a moment at the house. His eyes passed over Clara without registering her as significant, the way some men looked at doorways rather than at what was standing in them. Then back to Eli. My father and your father had an understanding, Cole. I know what they had, Eli said. I also know it was never written down. A man's word should be enough. Your father's word or yours? A silence. The second man, who hadn't spoken, shifted his horse slightly to the left, which put him at a slightly different angle to Eli. Clara noticed it. She didn't think Eli missed it either. We'll talk about this again, the man said. He said it pleasantly, which was worse than if he'd said it any other way. Whenever you're ready, Eli said. They rode out. Eli watched them until they cleared the gate, then turned and came back toward the house. He saw Clara in the doorway, and his expression did something brief and private that she didn't quite catch before it settled back into neutral. Who was that? She said. Dale Whitmore, Eli said. Runs the Whitmore spread about 4 miles east. Him and his father before him have been testing that north boundary since I was 12 years old. He said your fathers had an agreement. They had a conversation, Eli said. Once. My father told him the boundary was the survey line. Whitmore Sr. chose to hear it differently. He stopped at the kitchen door, and Clara stepped back to let him in. He went for the coffee pot. That's been Whitmore's whole approach to this county for 30 years. He hears things the way he wants to, and then acts like everyone else is the one misremembering. Does he have any legitimate claim? No. Eli poured his coffee. He offered her the pot. She held out her cup. But legitimate and persistent are two different things. She filed that away. I found your water rights agreement, she said. He looked at her over his cup. There's a renewal clause, she said. It comes due in about 6 months. If you don't file the renewal, the agreement lapses and has to be renegotiated from the start. He was quiet for a moment. Pete was supposed to handle that. Pete's been gone 3 years. I know how long Pete's been gone, he said, with an edge she hadn't heard from him before. Not at her, she didn't think. At the situation, at himself, maybe. I can prepare the renewal filing, she said. It's not complicated, but it has to be done on time and correctly. He looked at her for a long moment. How did you find that in one morning? I read everything, she said. That's the job. He set his cup down. He looked out the kitchen window at the empty yard where Whitmore's horses had been. What else did you find? A double payment to Calhoun in Mira Springs, or a non-payment, I can't tell which yet, a payroll discrepancy going back about 18 months, and 3 receipts for fence materials I can't match to any supply invoice in the box. He was quiet. None of it's necessarily bad, she said. Some of it might have legitimate explanations. I just need the time to trace it through properly. How long? Give me the rest of the week. He picked up his cup again. He looked at her with the particular attention of someone deciding how far to trust a thing. Clara held herself still under it, the way she'd learned to hold still under difficult looks. Not defensive, not performing comfort, just present. All right, he said. Smile. She rode back to town that evening with her back aching and her mind full of numbers and the particular satisfaction she'd almost forgotten. The feeling of work that used the parts of her that actually worked. Not the parts that were supposed to make her a good wife, the parts that were actually useful. Mrs. Pettiford was at the front desk when she came in. You were out all day, the woman said, with a transparency that was almost impressive. I was working, Clara said. Working. The word came out with a faint inflection that asked several questions at once, without technically asking any. At the Cole Ranch, Clara said. Bookkeeping. Mrs. Pettiford's face changed in a way that Clara recognized as the recalibration of someone who had already built a story about another person and is now being forced to edit it. Eli Cole's ranch? That's the one. She went upstairs before anything else could be said. She washed her face and sat on the edge of the bed and permitted herself, for about 45 seconds, to feel the full weight of the day. The crate of papers, Whitmore's voice from the yard, the water rights clause, the way Eli had looked at her when she'd answered his question. That's the job. She'd said it simply, which is the only way she knew how to say things, and he'd heard it the way she'd meant it. That didn't usually happen. Then she picked up her notebook and wrote down everything she remembered from the day before she lost it to sleep. The second morning, she arrived at 6:48 and let herself in without knocking, because she'd been told to, and because the kitchen door had been left open, which seemed like permission. The coffee was fresh. There was a plate on the table with a cloth over it. Biscuits, she discovered, and 2 pieces of cold bacon. No note, no explanation. She ate them and got to work. By the end of the second day, she had the payroll discrepancy traced. Not fraud, as it turned out, but a genuine misunderstanding between Pete and one of the hands about what rate had been agreed on for a particular season's work. The hand, a man named Voss, who'd been with the ranch for 4 years, had been underpaid by a small but real amount for 18 consecutive months. She wrote it up cleanly on a fresh page. She brought it to Eli that evening before she left. He was at the fence line on the east pasture doing something with a post that had gone soft at the base. She waited while he finished, because interrupting a man mid-fence was either rude or dangerous depending on the circumstance. He came over and read what she'd written, standing there with dirty hands and sawdust on his shirt. Voss, he said. Yes. He never said anything. Probably didn't think it would help to, she said, or didn't know how to calculate it himself. I can give you the exact figure if you want to make it right. Eli folded the paper. He looked across the pasture to where Voss was visible near the far water tank. I'll talk to him tonight, he said. Make the calculation. She did. She gave it to him on a fresh slip of paper, the exact amount, to the cent. He took it. He didn't say thank you, but the way he took the paper, carefully, like it mattered, was close enough to the same thing. She was 3 days into the week when the thing happened that she hadn't expected. She'd found a discrepancy she couldn't explain on her own. It was in the breeding stock records, a purchase from Calhoun in Mira Springs, a significant one, 4 breeding mares, that appeared in the records but was missing its transfer of title documentation, which meant either the title documents were somewhere else in the ranch's files, or the purchase had never been fully completed, or someone had paid for animals whose paperwork hadn't followed. She needed to ask Eli about it, which meant finding him, which on a working ranch at mid-morning meant going outside and using her eyes. She found him in the barn. He was sitting on an overturned bucket, and there was a young horse, barely more than a foal, really, maybe 8 months, standing in the open space of the barn with its head near Eli's shoulder, and Eli had one hand resting lightly on the animal's neck and was saying something to it in a voice too low for Clara to hear from the barn door. She stopped. Not because it was sentimental exactly, because it was private and she recognized that even from 30 feet away. The horse was scared of something. She could read it in the way the animal held its body, too tense, too careful. And Eli was not fixing that with force or efficiency. He was just being quiet and present and letting the animal decide when it was done being scared. She'd seen her father do the same thing many times in the horse barn in Missouri. She waited in the doorway. After a while, the young horse dropped its head and blew out a long breath, and something went out of its posture. Eli's hand moved once, gently, and then he stood up. He saw her. "Sorry to interrupt," she said. "You didn't," he said. "She just needed a minute." "New animal?" "Bought her last month from a man outside of Dalton who didn't know what he was doing with horses." He looked at the young mare, who had moved to the back of the space and was now interested in a shadow on the wall. "She's better than she was." "I had a question about the Calhoun purchase," Clara said. "The 4 mares from 18 months ago. I can't find the transfer of title." His expression shifted. Not guilty, more like something he'd put away and didn't enjoy being asked to take back out. "That's a situation," he said. "I gathered. Calhoun said he'd send the titles with the next delivery. Then there wasn't a next delivery. Then I wrote him twice and got no answer." He pushed the barn door open a little wider and looked toward the pasture. "Those mares are in the field. They're on my land. I paid for them in full. But the legal title is—" "Unresolved," Clara said. "Unresolved." She made a note. "Have you talked to anyone about it? Gerald Fitch at the land office?" "I talked to the lawyer in Mira Springs once. He said I had a case, but it would take time and money." He paused. "I chose not to spend either at the time." "You may want to revisit that," she said. "If Whitmore's going to keep pushing on the north boundary, you want your land holdings as clean as possible. Any unresolved ownership issue is something a persistent man can use." Eli looked at her. This time, the look lasted a little longer than the others had. "You see it that way," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I see what's in the records," she said. "What's in the records tells a story. Sometimes the story has a problem in it that looks small until someone uses it." He was quiet for a moment. The young horse made a small sound in the back of the barn. "You're good at this," he said. She didn't deflect it the way she might have a week ago. "I know," she said. Something almost moved across his face then, a thing she couldn't name but that seemed for just a moment like it had nothing to do with water rights or missing title documents. Then he looked back at the barn door. "Write up what you think should be done about Calhoun," he said. "I'll look at it tonight." She went back to the office. She sat down at the desk. She looked at the 3 piles which had reorganized themselves over the week into something that was starting to resemble actual structure. She picked up her pencil. She realized she hadn't thought about Harlan Greer once that day. Not his note, not the boy with the jam on his cheek, not the faces on the street. She'd been too busy. She'd been too useful. She'd been too real. She pressed the pencil to the page and started writing, and outside the office window the Texas afternoon went on in its vast, indifferent way. And it didn't occur to her until much later, riding back to town in the evening light, that she'd spent the entire day working inside a house that was not hers in a county that hadn't decided whether to accept her, and she had not once felt the need to pull her bonnet low. She'd left it on the hook by the kitchen door that morning. She hadn't noticed until now. She rode through the late color of the evening and thought about that, and let it mean what it meant, and didn't rush it into anything it wasn't ready to be. The newspaper had been in the barn for at least 2 years. That was Clara's first thought when she saw it. Not what it said, but how long it had been sitting there, wedged between a wooden beam and the wall behind the old saddle rack, brown at the edges. The ink faded to the particular gray that happened when paper spent a long time in heat and dust without anyone paying it attention. One of the hands had found it while doing the kind of deep cleaning that only happened when something else needed to happen first. In this case, replacing 2 planks in the rack that had gone punky with age. The hand who found it was the youngest one. His name was Tommy, and he was 17, and he was not the sort of person who understood that some things were better left where they were. He brought it to the bunkhouse. He showed it to the others. Clara didn't know any of this until the Friday of her second week, when she arrived at the ranch and felt the quality of the quiet change the moment she walked through the kitchen door. She'd learned the sounds of the Cole ranch by then, the particular rhythms of a working morning, the voices of the hands at their distances, the way the yard settled into a pattern she could read without looking directly at it. This morning the pattern was off. Not dramatically, just off. Eli was at the kitchen table, but not with coffee. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table and something in front of him, and he looked up when she came in with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not troubled, exactly, or not only that. More like a man standing at a place where 2 roads met and neither of them went anywhere simple. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She kept her coat on for the moment because, whatever this was, she wanted to be able to feel her own edges while she heard it. He turned the newspaper around and pushed it across the table toward her. It was a Missouri paper, the Kansas City Courier, or what had been the Kansas City Courier, dated 4 years back. The front page was a tangle of different stories arranged in the way newspapers arranged things then. Columns running side by side so that you had to pick your story and follow it down. He'd folded it so that one particular column faced up. Alderton Estate dissolved. Following creditor claims, the headline read, "Prominent horse breeding family of Cooper County loses holdings after contested settlement." She read it. She read it carefully, the way she'd read Harlan Greer's note, looking for a different meaning, some angle that changed what was plainly there. There wasn't one. The article was brief and factual and thorough in the way bad news in newspapers always was. It named the estate. It named the creditors. It named the principal parties involved in the settlement. It named her father. And at the bottom, in a single line that the journalist had included almost as an afterthought, it named the man who had purchased the largest parcel of the Alderton land holdings at the settlement auction. Thomas Cole, Eli's father. She set the paper down. She looked at the table for a moment rather than at Eli, because she needed a second to put things where they belonged. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, she could hear a horse moving in the near pasture, and somewhere farther out one of the hands calling to another. "How long have you known?" she said. "Since this morning," he said. "Tommy found it in the barn. He didn't know what it was, but he showed it around." A pause. "Holt recognized your name." Holt was the oldest hand, 50-something, had worked this ranch since before Eli's father died. She'd spoken with him twice, both times about supply records. She hadn't known he was paying that kind of attention. "Clara Ren was my mother's name," she said. "Her maiden name. My full name is Clara Alderton Ren." She said it the way you said something you'd been careful not to say for a long time. Not performing calm, just tired of the weight of it. "After my father died and the estate went to creditors, I didn't want to carry the name into whatever came next. I wasn't hiding from anything illegal. I just didn't want to be the Alderton girl who lost everything. I wanted to be someone who could start over." "I understand that," Eli said. She looked at him then. He was watching her with the same steady attention he gave to things that mattered to him. The account discrepancies, the young mayor, the boundary dispute with Whitmore. It was not the look of a man calculating his exposure. She had enough experience with that particular look to know the difference. "Your father bought the land at auction," she said. "He did." "Was it a fair price?" Eli was quiet for a moment. Not the guilty kind of quiet, the kind that came from a man who was trying to be honest rather than just trying to sound honest, which took longer. "I don't know what the land was worth at the time," he said. "I know what my father paid. I know the estate had creditors who needed to be satisfied." He stopped. "I know that the Alderton family had more land than the settlement accounted for, and that some of the boundary lines that ended up in the county records afterward look different than the original survey maps I have in the filing cabinet." Clara felt something tighten in her chest. "You've seen the original maps." "My father kept them. I found them after he died, and I didn't understand what I was looking at, so I filed them." He pushed his chair back slightly, not retreating, more like giving the truth room. "I understand it better now." She stood up. Not dramatically, just because sitting felt wrong all of a sudden, like she'd been still too long. She went to the kitchen window and looked out at the yard. The morning was clear, the kind of Texas morning that looked like a promise before the heat got to it. "How much land?" she said. "Maybe 200 acres on the eastern edge. The map suggests the boundary line got moved somewhere between the auction and the county filing." He paused. "I can't prove it was intentional. My father's dead. The man who filed the records for the estate is dead. Everyone who was in that room is gone except the land," Clara said. "Yes." She pressed 2 fingers against the window frame and held them there. 200 acres. Her father's land. The land her father had bred horses on for 30 years, that she'd ridden across every morning of her childhood, that had been in the Alderton family since before she was born. 200 acres that had slipped sideways in a county record somewhere between her father's death and her mother selling her brooch to help Clara buy a train ticket to a man who would reject her from a photograph. She became aware that her jaw was very tight. She made herself unclench it. "I didn't come here knowing," she said. She turned away from the window. "I want you to understand that. When Gerald Fitch said your name in that hotel dining room, I had no idea. I came because I needed work, and someone said you needed a bookkeeper." "I know," he said. "You can't know that." "No," he said. "You're right. I can't know it for certain. But I watched you work for 2 weeks, and you never went looking for anything except what was in the crate. You could have found those filing cabinet maps in the first 2 days if you'd been looking for something specific." He leaned forward slightly in the chair. "You weren't looking. You were just doing the job." She didn't say anything for a moment. There was a truth in what he said that she wanted to be careful with, because the easiest thing in the world right now would be to feel grateful toward him in a way that let her off the hook from the harder question. "What are you going to do?" she said. "I was about to ask you the same thing," he said. "I'm asking you first." He was quiet again with that same deliberate quality. Outside, the horse in the pasture had stopped moving. The morning sat around them like it was waiting too. "I can't give back what my father bought," he said. "Legal or not, those records have been in place for 20 years, and no court in this county is going to—" He stopped, started again. "What I can do is acknowledge it, and I can make sure that whatever you earn here is paid to you fairly and without question for as long as you want the work." He looked at her steadily. "That's not enough. I know it's not enough, but it's what's honest." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She'd been held together for so long by the practical. The numbers, the lists, the notebook, the careful management of what she had and what she needed. It was what kept her upright through 11 days on a stagecoach and a boy with a note and 2 weeks of being the town's favorite cautionary tale. Practical, managed, held in. She didn't cry. She was not going to cry in Eli Cole's kitchen, but something did shift somewhere deep in the architecture of how she'd been holding herself, and it was not the relief she'd expected to feel at being found out. It was something stranger than that, something that felt almost like being set down. "I need to see those maps," she said. "I'll get them," he said, and went. She spent the rest of the morning with the filing cabinet maps spread across the office desk. Eli sat in the chair he'd pulled up to the corner and didn't offer opinions, which she appreciated, because she needed to see this clearly, and other people's emotions had a way of blurring her own vision. The maps were old, hand-drawn surveys from before the county had standardized its recording system, which meant they required some interpretation. But Clara had grown up studying maps exactly like these. Her father had taught her to read land surveys the same way he'd taught her to read ledgers, because both were just ways of understanding what you owned and what you owed. The discrepancy was there. It wasn't ambiguous once you laid the original survey next to the county filing. The eastern boundary of the Alderton parcel, the one that had been sold at auction, had been shifted approximately 212 acres at some point between the original deed and the county's recorded version. It was possible it was a surveying error. It was possible someone had made a copying mistake. It was also possible, and this was the thing she kept having to put down and pick back up, that someone had done it deliberately. "I need to take these to Gerald Fitch," she said finally. Eli looked up. "Why Fitch?" "Because he's the land office. Because if there's a clerical error in the county records, he's the person who can tell me whether it can be corrected." She paused. "And because I want an official set of eyes on this that isn't either of ours." He nodded slowly. "You want me to come with you?" "No," she said. She said it without hesitation. "If you come with me, it becomes a land dispute between two ranchers. If I go alone, it's a records question brought in by someone who found a discrepancy while reviewing files." She looked at him. "Let me try it that way first." He thought about it. "All right. I'll need to borrow the maps. Take them." She rolled them carefully and put them in the leather document case she'd bought at the general store in her first week. The practical purchase. The one that said she was planning to stay long enough to need a place to put papers. She'd thought of it as practical at the time. Now it felt like something else. Like she'd known something before she knew it. She rode into town that afternoon with the maps in the case across her saddle. Gerald Fitch was behind his desk when she arrived, and he looked at her over his glasses with the particular expression of a man who'd already heard something through the town's invisible network and was waiting to see how much she knew. "Sit down, Miss Ren," he said. "You've heard," she said. It wasn't a question. "Holt talks," Fitch said, not maliciously. "He just can't help it." He looked at the document case. "Are those what I think they are?" "Original Alderton survey maps," she said, "versus the county recorded boundaries." She unrolled them on his desk. Fitch looked at them for a long time. He was quiet in the way of a man who understood what he was looking at and was taking his time with it. He got up once to get a different set of county records from the shelf behind him. He compared pages. He went back to the maps. "Well," he said finally. "Well," she said. "This is a 200-acre problem," he said. 212, she said. He looked at her over his glasses again. "You counted." "I'm a bookkeeper." He sat back in his chair. He laced his fingers together and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way people looked at ceilings when they were deciding how honest to be. "The man who filed these county records was a fellow named Prescott. He was the county recorder from before your father's time until he died about 12 years ago." He paused. "Prescott worked very closely with certain larger landholders in this county. That's all I'll say about that." "Whitmore," Clara said. Fitch was quiet for a moment. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." That she'd been running the pieces together since the morning. Whitmore's pressure on Eli's north boundary, the way a persistent man used every angle available, the way certain men in small counties had long memories and longer reaches. Did Whitmore's family benefit from Prescott's record-keeping in other cases? "That," Fitch said, "is a question that would require a thorough review of a great many county records, which I happen to have been doing quietly for about 8 months. He looked at her directly now. "For reasons that are not entirely unrelated to what you're looking at on this desk." Clara felt the shape of something larger begin to assemble itself in her mind. Not quite visible yet, like a structure seen in fog. You could tell it was there, you could tell it was large, but the full outlines were still unclear. "How many other ranches?" she said. "That's what I don't know yet." He looked at the maps. "What I know is that Prescott's records from a particular 7-year period have irregularities that I can't explain as clerical error. There are too many of them. They all favor the same direction, and they all happen to have benefited the same set of people. He paused. Your father's estate was not the only one. She sat with that for a moment. Her father's face came into her mind, not the dying version, the one at the end when everything had already been taken, but the earlier one, standing in the doorway in the morning light, telling her that a person who knew their own value didn't need the world to agree. He'd been a good man, a careful man. He'd lost his land not because he was careless, but because someone had been patient and systematic and had used the machinery of record-keeping to take it in pieces small enough that no single piece looked like theft. I can help you, she said. Fitch looked at her. I spent 3 years managing accounts for a horse operation, she said. I spent the last 2 weeks inside Eli Cole's records. I know what legitimate entries look like, and I know what mistakes look like, and I know the difference between those and something else. She looked at him steadily. If you have 8 months of quiet review and you still don't have the full picture, it's because you're working alone and you don't have someone who can read the financial side of it while you read the legal side. Fitch was quiet for a long moment. This would put you in an uncomfortable position, he said, given your connection to one of the affected estates. I know, she said. I'm offering anyway. And Eli Cole? He knows about the maps? He's the one who showed them to me, she said. He's not fighting it. He's the one who told me to bring them to you. Something shifted in Fitch's face. Not quite surprise, but a revision of something. He said that. He said he wanted things to be honest. Fitch looked at the maps on his desk for a long time. Then he reached across carefully and began to roll them back up. I have 3 boxes of records from Prescott's tenure in the storage room, he said. They're in no particular order. It took me 2 months just to understand what I was looking at. He looked at her over his glasses. If you have time on Saturdays, and if Cole doesn't need you, I'll make time, she said. She rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon with the maps in the case and the particular buzzing clarity that came from understanding for the first time that this wasn't just her story. It was larger than her. It had started before her. And the path through it ran not through anger or grief or the satisfaction of a confrontation, but through exactly the thing she'd always been best at. Records, numbers, the patient, methodical work of making the truth visible. She found Eli at the east fence line again. He was always at the east fence line when something was working in him. She tied her horse and walked over, and he turned when he heard her coming. Fitch confirmed the discrepancy, she said. He nodded once. He'd been expecting it. There's more, she said. It's not just your father and mine. Prescott was working systematically over a period of years. Fitch has been investigating. He thinks there are other families. She paused. He thinks it ties back to Whitmore. Eli looked at the fence post. He was quiet for a long moment. Not the deliberating kind, the processing kind. She was learning to read the difference. Whitmore's been in the county since his grandfather's time, he said. His father ran things here for 20 years. The name is on half the buildings in town. I know. If you're right, if this goes where it looks like it's going... He stopped. A lot of people aren't going to like it. I know that too, she said. He turned and looked at her. The evening light was doing what it did out here, going amber and long and relentless, the kind of light that didn't let you hide anything you might have preferred to keep in shadow. Why are you still here? He said. It wasn't cruel. It was a real question, asked quietly, by a man who understood that she could leave and who was asking her why she hadn't. She thought about it. She owed him a real answer rather than a comfortable one. Because leaving doesn't fix anything, she said, and because the work isn't done. She met his eyes. And because you showed me those maps when you didn't have to. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for the exchange of information. Then he looked back at the fence. I've got 2 posts to finish before dark, he said. I'll start on Prescott's files Saturday, she said. She walked back to her horse. She didn't look back, but she heard him, behind her, go back to work. The sound of the post driver, steady and regular, the way he did everything, without drama, without waste. She mounted and turned toward town. The road back to Hallow Creek was 4 miles of flat Texas evening, and she rode it thinking about maps and records and the difference between what got written down and what was true, and how much of a person's life could turn on which of those 2 things had more power on a given day. Her father had known what his land was worth. He'd known where his borders ran. He'd had maps and records and surveys and 30 years of work that said exactly what he owned. And none of it had been enough, because someone with patience and access and no conscience had simply waited and filed the right papers at the right time and let the official record do the work that force couldn't do without drawing attention. That was the thing about men like that, Clara thought. They didn't take things loudly. They took them quietly through clerks in county offices and the boring machinery of record-keeping that most people never looked at because most people trusted that it worked honestly. Most people. She was not, she had decided, going to be most people anymore. She rode through the darkening evening, and for the first time since she'd stepped off the stage in Hallow Creek with a note in her hands and 37 people watching, she didn't feel like a woman waiting for the next thing to go wrong. She felt like a woman who had found the right problem. The 3 boxes from Prescott's tenure smelled like time, dust and old ink, and the particular staleness of paper that had been in a closed room for years without anyone caring enough to open it. Fitch had stacked them in the corner of the storage room behind his office, and on that first Saturday, Clara moved them to the work table by the window and started going through them the same way she'd gone through Eli's apple crate, methodically, without rushing, reading everything before deciding what anything meant. Fitch worked at his own desk on the other side of the partition, and they didn't talk much during those first hours, which suited them both. He was a man who worked in quiet the same way she did, concentrated, unhurried, with the particular patience of someone who understood that the truth didn't give itself up to people in a hurry. By noon, she had made her first real finding. It wasn't dramatic. It rarely was, with records. It was a single entry in a property transfer document from 19 years back, a notation in the margin, handwritten in a different ink than the main document, that changed the stated acreage of a parcel belonging to a family named Duchamp from 480 acres to 390. The notation had no date, no signature, no official mark of any kind. Someone had simply written a different number in the margin, and the county record had reflected that number instead of the original survey. She took it to Fitch. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Duchamp, he said finally. Jean Duchamp, French family, came out from Louisiana in the 40s, ran sheep on the south pasture land. He set the page down. His grandson, Ellis Duchamp, farms about half that acreage now, southeast of town. Has no idea why his land stops where it does. 90 acres, Clara said. That's not a clerical error. A clerical error is transposing 2 digits. This is a different number entirely. I know. Where did the 90 acres go? Fitch looked at her over his glasses. He didn't answer the question directly, which was itself an answer. Whitmore? She said. The parcel immediately south of the Duchamp land was absorbed into the Whitmore holdings about 18 years ago, Fitch said carefully. The recorded boundary on the Whitmore side was adjusted to accommodate it. Clara sat down. She looked at the document in her hands and thought about Ellis Duchamp farming 390 acres, working himself half to death to make it produce, not knowing that 90 acres of what should have been his family's land was sitting inside the Whitmore fence line because a county recorder with a different colored pen had decided to write a smaller number in a margin. She thought about her father. She put the document in the pile that was growing to the left of the work table, the pile she'd labeled in her notebook as confirmed irregularities, and she went back to the boxes. By the 3rd Saturday, she had 11 confirmed irregularities spanning 14 years of Prescott's tenure. They varied in size. The smallest was a 20-acre adjustment to a parcel belonging to a German immigrant family named Bauer. The largest was the Alderton Estate's 212 acres. But they shared a pattern that was no longer possible to explain away as error. The adjustments always moved in the same direction. They always benefited the same cluster of established landholders, and they always happened to properties whose owners were either newly arrived, recently bereaved, or in some form of financial difficulty at the time of filing. People who were distracted, people who trusted the process because they had no reason not to. She laid it all out for Fitch on the 3rd Saturday afternoon, the documents arranged in chronological order across the work table, and she talked him through it the way she'd talked Eli through the ranch accounts. Clearly, specifically, with the actual numbers and the actual dates and the actual names. When she finished, Fitch was quiet for a long time. 11 cases, he said. 11 confirmed. There may be more I haven't found yet. And Whitmore is the consistent beneficiary. His holdings or his father's, yes. In 8 of the 11 cases directly, and in the other 3 through intermediary purchases that were completed within 2 years of the boundary adjustment. She paused. He bought land from neighbors who suddenly had less land than they thought, at prices that reflected the reduced acreage, which means he may not have been in the room when the records were changed, but he knew. Fitch took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes. He looked in that moment like a man carrying something he'd been carrying a long time. I suspected some of this, he said. I had pieces of it, but not the shape of it. I have the shape of it now, she said. The question is what you do with it. What we do with it, he said. He put his glasses back on. You've done half this work, Miss Ren. More than half. Clara, she said. It came out simply, without calculation. She'd been Miss Ren to him for 3 weeks, and it had served its purpose, but she was tired of it. He looked at her for a moment. Clara, he said. All right. What does this need to move forward, she said. Legally? It needs a lawyer who's not connected to Whitmore, which rules out 2 of the 3 practicing attorneys in this county. He thought for a moment. There's a man in Dalton, Samuel Reed, who handles land cases. He's handled cases against established interests before. He paused. It also needs the affected families to be willing to come forward. Records alone aren't enough. Someone has to stand in front of a judge and say this happened to them. Would the Duchamp come forward? I don't know. Ellis Duchamp is a cautious man. He has children. He's not going to want to make enemies of the Whitmore family if he can avoid it. What about the Bowers? Heinrich Bauer is 73, and his English is still uncertain. Fitch looked at the documents on the table. The difficulty is that everyone who was harmed by this was harmed in ways that were designed to be deniable and slow. By the time a family realizes their land is smaller than it should be, years have passed. The man who filed the records is dead, and proving intent is hard, Clara said. Very. She looked at the documents. 11 cases. 11 families who'd had pieces of their land taken from them by a pen in a margin, and most of them didn't even know it. What about bringing it to the state level, she said. If the county records were systematically falsified, that's not just a local matter. That's a pattern of fraud across multiple properties over multiple years. Fitch looked at her with something that was either surprise or the next thing past it. That would require taking it to the state land commissioner's office. Is there a reason not to? It would make a great deal of noise, he said. Whitmore has connections at the county level. The state level, I'm less certain. If it makes noise, Clara said, it also makes it harder to make the problem disappear quietly, which is presumably how it got this far in the first place. Fitch was quiet. Then he said, You've thought about this. I've thought about nothing else for 3 weeks, she said. My father was a good man who kept careful records and trusted that the systems around him were honest. He was wrong about that, and it cost him everything, and then it cost me most of what I had. She kept her voice level. I'm not interested in a resolution that stays quiet enough that the next family doesn't find out until it's already happened to them. He nodded slowly. I'll write to Samuel Reed, he said, and to the state office. When? Monday morning, he said. She started rolling the documents back into their protective tubes. I'll have clean copies of everything by Monday morning, she said, so he has something to read. She rode back to the ranch that evening later than usual, and Eli was on the porch when she arrived, which was not something she was accustomed to. He normally had the particular quality of a man who didn't wait on things. He was always in motion, always at the next task. Sitting on the porch suggested he'd run out of next tasks, or decided to stop pretending he had them. He watched her tie the horse. He didn't say anything until she came up the porch steps. How'd it go? He said. I have 11 cases, she said. 14 years. Whitmore is the pattern. He absorbed that. He was sitting with his arms on his knees and his hat pushed back on his head, and he looked out at the yard while he thought about it the way she'd seen him look at things that required the whole of him. He's going to find out, Eli said. I know. He has friends here, a lot of friends. I know that too. When he finds out it was your work, then he finds out, she said. She sat down in the other chair on the porch because her back hurt and the ride had been long and she was past performing indifference to her own tiredness. I didn't come to this county looking for a fight, but I'm not going to stop because someone with a long name and a long history here decides he'd rather I didn't. Eli looked at her then. There was something in his face in the evening light that she was starting to recognize, a particular quality of attention that he gave to very few things. She'd seen it with the young mare. She'd seen it sometimes with the land itself when he looked out at the pasture from the east fence line. It was the way Eli Cole looked at things he considered genuinely worth looking at. "Fitch is going to read in the state office," she said. "Good. It could get complicated for you," she said. "Your father bought land from the estate. Even if the original purchase was legitimate, the boundary discrepancy makes the Cole Ranch part of the evidence chain." "I know. You're not worried about that?" He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything. "I'm worried about it the way I'm worried about a fence that needs repair," he said. "It's a problem. You deal with it." He looked back at the yard. "I'm not going to ask you to leave it alone because it's inconvenient for me." She looked at him for a moment. Most people would. Most people weren't shown the maps by their own father and then decided to file them in a cabinet and not look at them for 4 years, he said. He said it flatly, without self-pity or drama, but it cost him something to say it. She could tell. "I had a choice, and I made the comfortable one, and it wasn't right." He paused. "I'm not making that choice again." She didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say to that, and Eli was not a man who needed her to make him feel better about a thing he'd already decided. The evening settled around them. A coyote somewhere out in the grass, far enough away that it was almost pleasant. The last of the light going out at the horizon in a thin line of red. "I need to tell you something else," she said. "Something I haven't said yet." He waited. "When I first rode out here, when I asked you for the job, part of what I was thinking was that this was the only option I had left. It wasn't purely about your records. It was about my $42 and a hotel I couldn't afford for much longer." She kept her eyes on the horizon. "I want you to know that." "I know that," he said. "I'm telling you because I don't want the version of this where you think it was more calculated than it was. It wasn't a scheme. It was a woman with no good options picking the least bad one." "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "I hired you because you rode 4 miles to a ranch you'd never been to and made a clear, sensible case for why I should pay you money," he said. "I didn't care why you needed the job. I cared whether you could do it." A pause. "You can. That's the whole of it." She held his eyes for a moment. Then she looked back at the horizon. "I'm going to need 2 more Saturdays with those records," she said. "Maybe 3. Take what you need." The trouble arrived on a Wednesday. It came in the shape of Dale Whitmore riding into the Cole Ranch yard at mid-morning with 2 men behind him and the particular kind of deliberateness that said this was not a social call. Clara was in the office. She heard the horses. She heard Eli come out of the barn. She did not go to the window. She went to the filing cabinet, retrieved the copy she'd made of the Alderton survey maps and the summary document she'd prepared for Fitch, and she folded them into the inside pocket of her coat. Then she went to the window and looked. Whitmore was talking. Eli was standing in the yard with his hands at his sides, which Clara had learned was Eli's way of being very still when something required it. His face was unreadable from the office window. Whitmore's was not. Even from 50 feet away, she could see the particular quality of his expression, the smooth, social surface with something harder underneath it, the face of a man who was accustomed to conversations going the way he aimed them. She heard her name. Not from outside, from the hallway. She turned. Holt was in the doorway of the office, and his face had the look of a man who'd been a loyal hand for 20-some years and was currently being tested on what that meant. "Whitmore knows you've been at Fitch's office," Holt said. "He knows about the records." "How?" "His foreman's cousin works at the feed store," Holt said. "That's how everything gets everywhere in this county." Clara nodded. She'd known it would come. She'd known it would come through exactly this kind of small-town cross-connection that was impossible to predict and impossible to prevent. "What does he want?" He wants Eli to let you go. Holt said it without apology or cushioning. He was not a man who prettied things up. He says you're stirring up old business that benefits no one, and that a smart man would keep his hired help from making problems for the whole county. She looked at Holt for a moment. He was watching her with the careful attention of someone who had reached his own verdict and was waiting to see if she confirmed it. "What do you think?" she said. He was quiet for a second. "I think Whitmore's father bought land from Ellis Duchamp's grandfather for 40 cents an acre less than it was worth, and Ellis Duchamp has been trying to make his numbers add up for 30 years without understanding why they never quite do." He looked at the floor. "And I think I've been in this county long enough to know that some things that got called settled never really were." She nodded. She went back to the window. Outside, Eli had not moved. Whitmore was talking with the practiced ease of a man who expected the conversation to end in his favor, because most of his conversations did. One of the men behind him had shifted his horse slightly to the left again, the same position she'd noticed the first time they'd come to the ranch. It was a habit, or a method. She went to the kitchen door and opened it. She walked out into the yard. Whitmore stopped talking mid-sentence. His eyes moved to her with a kind of recalibration that she recognized. The recalibration of a man who had been talking about someone and was now talking to them, and who understood, probably, that the two were different situations. "Miss Ren," he said. He said it pleasantly. He was always pleasant. She understood now that pleasantness was his primary instrument. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. She stopped beside Eli, not behind him. "Beside. I was just having a conversation with Cole here about some concerns I have," Whitmore said, "about some digging around that's been going on in county records." "That digging," Clara said, "has turned up 11 cases of falsified property boundaries spanning 14 years of your county recorder's tenure, 8 of which directly benefited your family's land holdings." She said it clearly, without emphasis or drama, the way you read a ledger entry. Just the numbers, just the facts. The pleasant expression on Whitmore's face did something. It didn't disappear. He was too practiced for that, but something beneath it shifted, the way ice shifts before it cracks. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "It's a description of documented records," she said. "The documents are with Gerald Fitch and with a lawyer in Dalton and with the State Land Commissioner's office." She paused. "Making accusations at this point would be redundant. The records make the case without my help." One of the men behind Whitmore moved his horse forward slightly. Eli took one step to his left, which put him between Clara and the horse without appearing to do so deliberately. It was a small movement. Whitmore noticed it. "You're making enemies you don't need to make," Whitmore said. He looked at Eli now rather than at her, because men like Whitmore always eventually looked at the man when they wanted the woman to understand something. "I've known your family since before you were born, Cole. Your father was a reasonable man." "My father bought land at an auction," Eli said. "He didn't ask enough questions about why the boundary lines looked different from the original survey. I'm asking those questions now." Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. The pleasantness was almost entirely gone now, replaced by something that was still controlled but was no longer pretending to be friendly. "People in this county have long memories," he said. "So do documents," Clara said. He looked at her. She held it. She had been holding difficult looks since she was 12 years old, and she had gotten reasonably good at it. He turned his horse. The two men followed. He didn't say anything else, which was, she thought, possibly the most honest thing he'd done in the entire conversation. They rode out of the yard and onto the road, and didn't look back. Eli let out a slow breath. "Well," he said. "Well," she said, "you walked out here on purpose." "He was talking about me," she said. "It seemed better that he talked to me." Eli looked at the gate where Whitmore had gone through. "He's going to push back." "I know. He has county connections." "Fitch has the state office," she said. "Whitmore's connections are local. The point of going to the state was to get it somewhere his local connections can't reach." Eli was quiet for a moment. "You thought that through." "I've been thinking about nothing else for a month," she said. He looked at her then with that particular quality of attention again. And this time she didn't look away from it, and neither did he, and it lasted a few seconds longer than anything strictly practical required. Then Holt appeared in the barn doorway and said something to Eli about the south fence, and Eli went, and Clara went back to the office. She sat down at the desk. Her hands were not shaking this time. She noticed that. A month ago, in this same county, she'd sat on a borrowed horse with shaking hands because someone had given her one chance and she hadn't known if she could hold it. She picked up her pencil. She had 2 more Saturdays with Prescott's boxes, and Samuel Reed would want a clean summary of the full pattern, and the water rights renewal still needed to be filed before the month was out. She turned to a fresh page and started writing. Outside, the ranch went about its morning. Horses, fence lines, the particular ongoing life of a place that worked whether or not anyone was watching it. The sound of it had become, without her entirely deciding this, a sound she recognized as familiar. Not home. Not yet, or not exactly. But the thing just before home, the thing that happens when a place starts to feel like it belongs to you even before you've settled the question of whether you belong to it. She wrote. The morning went on around her, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she did not feel like a woman waiting to find out what happened next. She felt like the one deciding it. Samuel Reed arrived in Hallow Creek on a Tuesday morning in early spring, 3 weeks after Fitch had written to him, and he was not what Clara had pictured. She'd imagined someone older, more formal, the kind of lawyer who wore his authority like a good coat. Reed was 40, maybe 42, with a thin face and the kind of eyes that moved quickly around a room and took inventory without appearing to. He wore a decent suit that had been on too many stage roads to look decent anymore, and he carried a leather satchel that was nearly as battered as Clara's document case. He shook her hand when Fitch introduced them, and he shook it the way he'd shake anyone's hand, which she appreciated. "You're the one who put together the summary," he said. "I am," she said. "It's good work," he said. "Clear, no editorializing." He set the satchel on Fitch's work table. "I've seen plenty of land fraud cases where the documentation was a mess because the person who assembled it was angry and let it show in how they organize things. Yours doesn't do that." "Being angry doesn't make the numbers clearer," Clara said. Reed looked at her for a moment, the quick inventory look. "No," he said. "It doesn't." They spent that morning going through everything she and Fitch had assembled. The 11 confirmed cases, the chronological pattern, the evidence chain connecting Prescott's marginal notations to the subsequent absorption of adjacent acreage into Whitmore family holdings. Reed asked precise questions and wrote down the answers in a small notebook with a shorthand she couldn't read. He didn't express outrage or satisfaction. He was building a structure, and he assessed each piece the way a builder assessed lumber, for load-bearing capacity, not for aesthetics. By noon, he sat back and looked at the ceiling. "The challenge," he said, "is intent. I can prove the records were changed. I can prove Whitmore's holdings expanded. Proving that he directed the changes or knew about them at the time they occurred is harder. Prescott is dead. Any conversation they had is gone." "There's a letter," Fitch said. Reed looked at him. "I found it this morning, actually, in the 4th box, which I hadn't fully gone through yet." Fitch reached into the file on his left and drew out a single page, handled carefully. "It's from Prescott to a man named Arlen Cross, who was Whitmore's land agent at the time. It references Fitch put on his glasses. "A boundary clarification on the Alderton parcel per our previous arrangement, and asks for the remaining payment to be delivered by the end of the month." The room was quiet. Clara looked at the letter. She had a specific feeling she recognized from accounting work. The moment when a column that wouldn't balance suddenly did, not because anything changed, but because the last entry finally appeared. "That's the piece," Reed said. He leaned forward. "May I?" He read it twice. He set it down and was quiet for 30 seconds. "I need to speak with Ellis Duchamp," he said, "and anyone else from the affected families who'll talk to me. I also need a formal statement from you." He looked at Clara. "Documenting how you found the materials and the methodology you used to identify the pattern." "I can have it by tomorrow morning," she said. He nodded. He looked at both of them. "This isn't going to be fast," he said, "and it isn't going to be quiet. You understand that." "We understand," Fitch said. Reed picked up the letter again. "Whitmore is going to call this a vendetta. He's going to say the records were misinterpreted by a woman with a personal grievance against his family. He said it without apology because it needed to be said. He's going to use the Alderton connection to try to discredit the source." "I know," Clara said. "It may work. With some people." "I know that too." She held his eyes. The letter doesn't have a personal grievance. The boundary maps don't have a personal grievance. The 11 families whose acreage was quietly reduced over 14 years don't have a personal grievance. Most of them don't even know yet that they have anything. Reed looked at her steadily. You're prepared for this to become public. If it stays quiet, Clara said, it stays the way it's been. And the way it's been is that people in this county have been losing land for 20 years and calling it bad luck. He nodded once. He picked up his satchel. I'll be at the hotel for the next 3 days, he said. I want to meet the Duchamps tomorrow afternoon, if Fitch can arrange it. I'll arrange it, Fitch said. Reed left. Fitch and Clara sat with the documents between them, and the afternoon came through the window at the angle it came in spring, lower and more honest than summer light. He's good, Clara said. He's the best there is west of San Antonio for this kind of case, Fitch said. He started carefully reorganizing the files. He took on the county commissioners in Beaumont 3 years ago over a water rights scheme. One. He paused. Lost half his practice afterward. The commissioner's friends stopped sending him work. Clara thought about that. He came anyway. He came because I told him what you found, Fitch said, and because some things matter more than the practice. She told Eli that evening. All of it. Reed, the letter, the timeline Reed had described for what came next. He listened without interrupting, which was his way. They were on the porch again, where they'd ended up most evenings lately, without either of them explicitly deciding to, the way certain habits form before you notice them forming. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The letter ties Prescott directly to Whitmore's agent, he said. Yes. That's enough to take it to a judge? Reed thinks so, combined with the pattern documentation. She looked out at the yard. It won't be fast. He said months, possibly longer if Whitmore's lawyers fight it at every step. They will, Eli said. He said it without bitterness, just as a fact about the way things worked. Whitmore's had those connections for 30 years. He'll use them. I know. Your name is going to be in the middle of this, he said. He wasn't warning her. He was telling her he understood it. My name was already in the middle of it the day Whitmore rode into your yard, she said. He looked at her. You're not scared. She thought about it honestly. I'm scared of the wrong outcome, she said. I'm not scared of the noise. She paused. I've been scared of smaller things than this. Being rejected from a photograph in front of 37 people. Asking a stranger for a job. Walking out into a yard when the conversation was about me. She looked down at her hands. Those things scared me more than they should have. This feels like the thing I was supposed to be doing. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the evening went another shade of dark. Stay, he said. She looked at him. Not for the case, he said, not for the books. You've made the ranch run better than it's run since my father was alive. And that matters, but that's not what I'm saying. He was looking at the yard, not at her, which she'd learned was how he said the things that cost him something. I'm saying that you should stay because this is where you belong, if you want it to be. She sat with that for a moment. It was not a romantic declaration exactly. It was not flowers or grand speeches. It was Eli Cole telling her a true thing in the plainest language he had, which was more than most people managed. I want it to be, she said. He nodded. He looked at the yard. She looked at it too. The water rights renewal got filed last week, she said after a while. I know, he said. Fitch confirmed it. The Calhoun title issue? Reed said he could send a letter on your behalf while he's here. Formal legal request for the transfer documents or return of payment. That'd be useful, Eli said. And you have a payroll discrepancy from 2 seasons back that Voss still hasn't. Clara, he said. She stopped. It's evening, he said. She looked at the sky, which had gone the color of old copper at the edge and deep blue straight above. It is, she said. The books will be there in the morning. They will, she said. She didn't say anything else for a while, and neither did he. And it was the most comfortable she'd felt in a silence in longer than she could remember. No. The state land commissioner's investigator arrived 6 weeks later. His name was a forgettable one, Briggs or Briggs something, but his authority was not forgettable. And the letter he carried from the commissioner's office had the particular weight of official paper that has real consequences attached to it. He spent 4 days in Hallow Creek. He met with Fitch and Reed. He met with Clara and reviewed her documentation. He met with Ellis Duchamp, who had, after a long conversation with Reed and his own wife, decided to come forward. He met with 2 other affected families who Reed had quietly identified and approached over the preceding weeks. He did not meet with Whitmore, which was its own kind of message. Clara was not in most of those meetings. That was Reed's work and Fitch's, the legal architecture of it, and she understood the difference between building a case and being a witness to it. She went to the ranch. She did the books. She filed the water rights renewal, confirmed, stamped, returned. She wrote to Calhoun in Mira Springs, a plain and factual letter about the missing title documents, and received a flustered reply within 10 days that amounted to an acknowledgement that a mistake had been made and a promise to send the correct paperwork immediately, which he did. She fixed the things she could fix. She let Reed fix the things that required a lawyer. Whitmore sent a man to the ranch on the 3rd day of Briggs' visit. Not Whitmore himself this time. A younger man, one she hadn't seen before, who spoke to Eli with the careful indirection of someone delivering a message that had been specifically designed to be deniable. The message, as best Clara understood from what Eli told her afterward, was that sensible people in this county looked after one another and that this kind of disruption served no one's long-term interests. Eli had listened to all of it. Then he'd said, "I appreciate you coming out," and walked back into the barn. The man left. Eli told Clara about it that evening, briefly, without drama. "That's it?" she said. "That was it," he said. She thought about all the ways that conversation could have gone differently. The ways that a man with more to lose, or more fear, or more appetite for the path of least resistance might have heard that message and made a different calculation. She thought about Eli at the east fence line, and the apple crate of records, and the maps he'd known about for 4 years and hadn't acted on, and the moment he'd decided to stop making the comfortable choice. People were not simple. That was something she'd had to learn and relearn her whole life. And it never got easier exactly, but it got more honest. Eli had made the wrong choice once, and then he'd made the right one, and he hadn't made a performance out of either. He'd just done it, the way he did most things, without announcement, without asking to be credited for it. She respected that more than she could quite say. Just set. The formal findings from the state commissioner's office came in late spring, 8 weeks after Briggs's visit. Fitch brought them to the ranch on a Saturday morning, which he'd never done before. He was a man of offices and regular hours, and his appearing at the ranch gate on a weekend meant something. Clara was in the office going through the quarterly supply accounts when she heard his horse, and she came out to the yard. He had the document in his hand. He didn't make her wait. 11 cases confirmed, he said. Prescott's alterations ruled to constitute systematic falsification of county records. Whitmore family holdings to be reviewed for boundary corrections on 8 of the 11 parcels. He paused. Arlen Cross, Whitmore's former land agent, has agreed to provide a full statement to the state investigator in exchange for consideration in his own case. Clara stood in the yard in the morning light and let that land. "The Duchamps?" she said. "Ellis Duchamp will have his 90 acres restored." Fitch said it carefully, like something fragile. "The Boer family will have their 20. The Alderton parcel." He paused. "The 212 acres cannot be separated from the Cole Ranch holdings at this stage without an extended legal process. Reed's recommendation is that the value be calculated and addressed through a compensatory settlement rather than physical boundary restoration." She'd expected this. She'd known since the beginning that land which had been folded into another ranch for 20 years, with fences and pastures built across it, could not simply be handed back in a clean reversal. The world didn't work that way. Wounds didn't unhappen. The best you could do was account for them honestly and try to make the math right, even when the geography couldn't be. "What does that mean in practical terms?" she said. "It means Eli Cole will pay a compensatory amount equal to the calculated value of the acreage at current rates into a settlement account," Fitch said. He looked at her carefully. "He already knows. I spoke with him before I rode out. He agreed without argument." She looked at the barn, where she could hear Eli working. Of course he had. She thought about telling him months ago. "I can't undo what my father bought, but I can make sure what you earn here is paid honestly." He'd been preparing for this before there was anything formal to prepare for. "The Whitmore family," she said. "What happens to Dale Whitmore?" "The formal findings don't include criminal charges. The primary responsible party was Prescott, who is dead. Whitmore's complicity is documented, but the standard for criminal culpability requires a clearer chain of direction than the letter and Cross's expected statement can fully establish." Fitch paused. "What it does mean is that his land holdings are under formal review, 3 of his county contracts are being examined, and his name is now attached to a state commissioner's finding of systematic fraud." He looked at her. "In this county, that's not nothing." "No," she said. "It's not nothing." It wasn't justice in the clean, complete way she'd wanted when she'd first laid out those 11 cases on the work table. She'd wanted the full account, every acre, every family, every year. But she'd spent enough time with ledgers to know that sometimes the books didn't balance perfectly, and you recorded what you could and noted the remainder and moved forward anyway, because waiting for perfect resolution was how you ended up waiting forever. She'd gotten the shape of the truth into the official record. She'd gotten names restored and land returned and a state finding that would sit in the commissioner's files permanently, not disappearing quietly the way these things had been disappearing for 20 years. That was real. That was enough to build on. Eli came out of the barn. He looked at Fitch, then at Clara. "You heard?" he said to her. "I heard." He nodded. He looked at Fitch. "Thank you for coming out." "Thank her," Fitch said without ceremony, and got back on his horse and rode out the gate. The town's understanding of Clara took longer to change than the official record did, because towns were not courts and did not operate on documented evidence. But it changed. It changed the way most things in small places changed, gradually, through small revisions, through the accumulation of incidents that told a different story than the first one. Ellis Duchamp stopped her on the main street one afternoon in early summer, a big, quiet man with his hat in his hands, and said what he had to say in 3 sentences without embellishment, that he'd known something was wrong with his land for 30 years, that he'd never been able to prove it, and that he was grateful. He put his hat back on and walked back to his wagon. Mrs. Pettiford, who had given her a hotel room at $2 a night and whispered about her in the hallway, now greeted her by name with a particular brightness that Clara recognized as the social brightness of someone who had reassessed something and was applying the correction visibly. Clara was never unkind to her about it. People revised their judgments when the evidence changed. That was actually what you wanted people to do. The general storeman's wife, who had said hard thing with curiosity in her voice, now asked Clara real questions when she came in. Practical questions about the ranch, about the land office situation, about how the Duchamps were doing. She'd become, in some incremental way that Clara couldn't point to exactly, a person this town talked to instead of about. Harlan Greer she saw exactly twice over that spring and summer. The first time was at the general store, and he nodded at her with the specific discomfort of a man who understood he'd made an error and had not yet decided how to address it. She nodded back and bought her pencils and left. The second time was in late summer, when he appeared at the ranch gate on a morning when Eli happened to be out at the north pasture, and Clara was the one who came to the gate. He sat on his horse with his hat in his hand, which was a gesture, and he said that he understood she'd done considerable work for the county, and that he'd been hasty in his judgment, and that he hoped there were no hard feelings. She looked at him for a moment. He was a decent-looking man, mid-40s, with the kind of face that had probably been more confident before the county had spent 6 months learning what Clara Alderton Ren was actually capable of. "Thank you for saying so," she said. "No hard feelings." She meant it. She had discovered, somewhere in the process of the last several months, that the anger she'd carried since she read his note on the Hallow Creek street had gone quiet somewhere along the way. Not because he'd deserved forgiveness particularly, but because she'd become so thoroughly occupied with things that mattered that there simply wasn't room for it anymore. He'd rejected her from a photograph and sent a child to deliver the verdict, and that had been unkind and small. But if he hadn't, she would not have stood in this yard. She would not have found the records. She would not have known Eli Cole or Gerald Fitch or Samuel Reed or the young mare in the barn who now came to the fence when she walked past. She would not have found the problem she was meant to solve. There was no simple way to account for that. The way a humiliation became a door, The way the worst morning of your life turned out to be the road to the only place you actually belonged. She didn't think it meant the humiliation was good or that Harlan Greer deserved credit for the outcome. It just meant that sometimes the path and the wound came from the same place, and you lived with both of them and let the one lead you somewhere the other couldn't. Greer rode away. She went back to the office. The bonnet was still on the hook by the kitchen door. She noticed it on a Tuesday morning in August, riding up to the ranch in the early light, and she realized she hadn't worn it in months. She'd worn it every day for the first 3 weeks in Hallow Creek, pulled low, a shield against eyes she didn't want to meet, a way of making herself smaller than she was so that the size of her situation didn't crush her completely. Then she'd started leaving it on the hook in the mornings, and then she'd forgotten to put it on at all, and now it hung there with a faint layer of dust on the brim. She went in and made coffee and went to the office and started on the day's work. Eli came in at 7:30 with mud on his boots and the look of a man who'd already been outside for 2 hours and had opinions about a fence post near the East Creek. She poured him coffee without being asked, which she'd started doing somewhere around the 6th week, and he took it without comment, which was its own kind of conversation. "Reed wrote," he said. "The settlement amount's been formalized." "I saw the letter," she said. "I want you to look at the payment structure before I sign anything," he said. "Make sure it's structured right." "I will." He drank his coffee. He looked at the hat hook by the door where her bonnet hung next to his 2 working hats and his good one. "You haven't worn that in a while," he said. "No," she said. He didn't say anything else about it. He didn't need to. That was one of the things about Eli Cole. He understood that some things that got said out loud lost something in the translation, and he left them where they were. She turned back to the desk. The account books for the 3rd quarter were open in front of her. The numbers were clean, cleaner than they'd been in years, possibly cleaner than they'd ever been. The Calhoun titles had arrived and were filed. The water rights renewal was confirmed. Voss had been paid the 18 months of underpayment without drama, had taken the money without making a point of it, which was the ranch's way of doing most things. The Cole Ranch was, by any reasonable measure, in better shape than it had been when Clara Ren had ridden up its road on a borrowed horse with $42 and a practical argument. She thought about what her father had said, that last morning in the doorway. A person who knows their own value doesn't need the world to agree with them. They just need one good chance. She'd thought about it the way you thought about things said by people you'd lost, as comfort, as memory, as something to hold when the ground went unsteady. She hadn't expected it to be a literal description of what was going to happen to her. She hadn't expected to ride into a town where someone would give her exactly that, and nothing more, and for it to turn out to be enough. One chance. That was all it had been. Eli hadn't rescued her. He'd given her a desk and a crate of papers and a fair wage, and she'd done the rest herself. That distinction mattered to her in a way she couldn't entirely explain but felt certain about. The value had been there before anyone named it. The work had been possible because she had the capacity for it, not because someone manufactured the capacity on her behalf. She had been overlooked for most of her adult life by people who formed their judgments quickly and saw only the surface, the photograph, the bonnet, the woman who'd been rejected, the name that had lost its money. She understood now that being overlooked was not the same as having no value. It was just a function of other people's limited attention. It was their deficit, not hers. That was the thing she wanted, if she ever had a daughter, to say to her first, that the world's opinion of you on any given Tuesday was not the final accounting, that the final accounting was done in the long run, in the work, in what you built, in what you fixed, and what you refused to let stay broken just because it was easier to leave it. The morning went on around her. Outside the window, the Texas summer was in full voice. Heat, grass, the particular silence of mid-morning before the afternoon wind came up. Inside, the numbers aligned themselves into cents on the page. She heard Eli's voice in the yard, talking to one of the hands about the south pasture rotation. She heard the young mare's sound from the barn. The animal had a specific voice she recognized now, had had since the spring, when it had decided somewhere in its private horse mind that this place was safe. You couldn't force that. You could only be consistent and patient and let the frightened thing come to its own conclusions in its own time. Clara picked up her pencil. She turned to a fresh page. She had work to do, and she had a place to do it, and the hat on the hook by the door had dust on its brim, And the morning outside the window was wide and clear and completely indifferent to anyone's first impression of anyone, which was, she had decided, exactly the right way for a morning to be.